We're going to shift now to our third presentation by Jen Gobby. Dr. Jen Gobby, thank you so much, Jen, for joining us. Jen is also a graduate from our Economics for the Anthropocene program, also part of the first cohort. And she's now doing a postdoc. She's a postdoctoral fellow at Concordia University in Montreal. And she's going to talk to us today about pushing for transformative change in times of crisis, what COVID-19 is teaching us about the fight for environmental and climate justice. So take it away, Jen.
Thanks, John. And thanks, Bindu and Keisha, for those great conversations. I will try to link to them in my talk. So yeah, I'm a doctoral fellow. I'm going to be presenting a bit today on some of a key finding or two from my PhD and how I'm building on that in my current postdoctoral work. So one of the main questions of my work, and it has been since the beginning of my PhD, is trying to understand how social movements, frontline communities, and ordinary folks can work together to push for transformative change. And it's based on this huge need for huge change that we see in this quote from the IPCC, that preventing climate catastrophe will require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. So it's a huge challenge, and a lot of the work I do is around the question of how do we actually do that kind of change. So the kinds of crises we're facing, including climate crises, e-waste pollution, environmental injustice, all these converging and overlapping and intertwining crises bring us to a place where huge scale, very quick change is necessary. How do we do that? So I spent my PhD years, 5 years, working with climate justice, anti-pipeline, and Indigenous land defense movements across Canada, and thinking about these big questions about social change together. And these are people who are not just fighting to reduce emissions. These are people who are fighting against structural inequality, against racism, against the ongoing colonial relations in Canada that are allowing the continuation and the expansion of the fossil fuel industry, which is, of course, driving the climate crisis. So these are people who are not just resisting, but also building beautiful alternatives all across the country. Putting tiny homes, affordable housing equipped with solar panels in the pathway of the pipeline routes that they're resisting. So this is amazing work, and I had the huge privilege of spending several years sitting down and thinking hard with other people about this kind of transformative change that is necessary and how we do that. So I'll be presenting a bit about that, but I want to share, we'll have the opportunity, that the two major outputs from my doctoral research are this book that is just come out this year called More Powerful Together, and then also a summary report that's a much more readable and free, and it's available on my website. But both of those go into much more detail about this sort of theory of transformative change from the ground up that we developed in the work, but that I'm going to be touching on briefly here. So first of all, one thing that's important to note is that the kind of large-scale change we're talking about is transformative change. Not all change is the same kind of change. So this is a definition I've been using about what transformative change means. It's an intentional process of systems change that not only addresses the symptoms, but the root causes of inequality, injustice, and unsustainability. And it's to bring about change at the level of the whole system, impacting social the values and beliefs, resource production, consumption patterns, rules and practices, technologies, infrastructures, and importantly, the distribution of power. So a lot of what we've been hearing in Bindu and Keisha's talk is really about the power structures of who gets to make decisions, who's benefiting, and who's being impacted by the kind of environmental and climate decision making being going on. So the kind of change necessary requires deep transformation in the power structures. How do we do that? So I've presented on this model of social change a couple of times lately, including to some of the same folks who are here, so I won't go into it in great detail. But this is when I asked like 100 people, activists, land defenders across the country, how do you think this kind of large scale social change can happen? I took all their answers, synthesized them all, brought them all together into dialogue with each other, like all pieces of a puzzle. And this is the model that came out, that in one broad sweep, social transformation could come about through the convergence of forces from the context in which we act. So the ways that timing, events happen, sometimes crises that make certain kinds of change more possible or even necessary. That really impacts what kind of whether social transformation can happen and how. But it also really matters how we understand and what we value, how we understand the systems, how our education systems set us up as agents of change or not. Narrative change, whose leadership are we following, and whose are the people who are most impacted? Are there the voices that are leading our transformative movements? But of course, it matters how we take action. So it's building power through collective action, engaging with the electoral system, making sure things are working in towards positive change in the electoral system, but also confronting and dismantling the power structures, like I was talking about before, and innovating and promoting solutions. But also super important, this came up again and again in the research, is that woven through all this is how we relate. So how people in different sectors and different movements, different structures, different communities are coordinating and sharing resources, information. How are those flows of resources and information going? Are we building relations of solidarity between movements, sectors, geographies, movements, etc.? And do we have the kind of relations that can allow for those links of solidarity? And until we undo domination, the ways that racism, sexism, classism play out on our movements and in our spaces, other kinds of transformative spaces, then we're not going to be able to build those relations of solidarity. So that really matters. So this is you can read about this in like 60 pages of detail in the book, or 3 pages of detail in the report. So this is, I'm not doing it justice here, but I brought it in because I wanted to segue to my current project. So when COVID hit in March, I remember thinking to myself, after having read so much literature on social transformation, academic literature, and talked to so many people in movements, and this theme of sometimes in times of crisis, there are conditions and situations in which transformative change becomes more possible. In all kinds of political directions, so everyone's trying to seize the crisis opportunities to push systems in the directions that they prefer. And so when COVID came up, I thought to myself, how is this going to be playing out? How are movements, how are frontline communities going to be seizing or responding to this crisis in ways that are pushing for transformative change? Because as climate change progresses, we're going to be facing more and more crises. If we can get good at seizing those crises as systems sort of are destabilized and need to be restructured all the time and rebuilt all the time, can we keep pushing towards justice, equality, sustainability, ecological viability in these times of crises? So this project I'm working on right now, as one of my 2 postdoc projects, is in partnership with the Shift Center for Social Transformation at Concordia. So we're working on this project together. They also have been trying to figure out how to support transformative responses to COVID in Montreal. So we worked together to launch this research project. And we decided to start it by identifying organizations, grassroots groups, communities across Montreal who are responding to COVID in ways that are aiming to change the way Montreal functions, the economic, the political, and the social systems. And so we did that. We started, we had a research assistant named Annabelle who helped a lot with this part, and she identified 77 different separate projects going on in Montreal during that time phase in the spring. And then we reached out to those groups, and we getting their feedback, what kind of research project would be directly useful to the work you're trying to do that would help push towards transformative change. So we had lots of conversations, we had several design meetings, and we came up with a research design that we're conducting now. So that was the first stage. And oh yeah, I just wanted to show you that we created a giant spreadsheet with many pages and like 77 rows, all of the different projects and the information about them. But I wanted to share here just a really brief overview of the 77 projects. So just as Montreal alone, right? Think about, North American scale or the local or the global scale. There are a lot of people doing a lot of work to respond to COVID in ways that are pushing for deeper long-term change. So just in Montreal, there are 16 different mutual aid groups that emerged. There are 16, and these are just the ones that we found. I'm sure we missed some, but there are 16 different projects that are actively working around the ways that the COVID has disproportionately been affecting women or racialized communities or elders, like so different ways that structural inequality is playing out and being exacerbated by the crisis. And so groups that are targeting that. There are 9 food access or food related projects around food security during crisis. There are 7 projects that are just focusing on visioning what a new normal is going to look like. That's just in Montreal. There are 6 that are focused on wealth distribution, housing, these kind of things. I'll talk more about that. 4 that are around helping deal with isolation that's coming from the crisis. 4 that are access to legal information. 3 that are trying to provide information about COVID services in many different languages, the many different languages that are spoken here in Montreal. And there are 3 that are providing protective equipment. I mean, there are thousands that are doing that, but 3 are doing it in ways that they're trying to provide protective equipment while at the same time trying to, break isolation or tackle structural inequality, et cetera. So I can talk more about that later if you want. And then there are ones that are around transport and delivery and trying to transform the way goods and services or goods are being transported and delivered around the city. So here are some exciting examples. There was, let's see, the Share My Check. I don't know, that was a campaign that was outside of Montreal, beyond Montreal, but included here, where people were being asked if they had the different benefits from COVID, if they had more money than they need to share checks with people who were facing extreme economic precarity. There was a rent strike to try to make sure that people were able to afford food, as opposed to like spending their last little bit of money on rent when they couldn't afford food. So there's a rent strike and working with landlords to help that be feasible. There was a move towards a big campaign that's been going on around about permanent status for all new Canadians and refugees or migrants for during this time, so people are at least securely can stay where they are. There's this amazing project called Project 10 that is aiming to break isolation amongst LGBTQ Two-Spirit youth in Montreal, and they've been doing their work specifically in a way that's responding to the increased isolation due to COVID. This is one of the visioning sessions, like this. So Climate Justice Montreal, which is a group I work with, has started this project to get different organizations, a group across the city together, of course on Zoom, to think together, to envision what a just recovery would look like in Montreal, and developing that across really different movements, like anti-racist movements, climate movements, housing rights movements, migrant right movements, and really creating a shared political vision. So that's been exciting. There's so many. I'm not going to go into them all. I'm going to move on, but we can talk more about any of these. But yeah, really inspiring to see all the efforts, again, just in Montreal alone. So we designed the project together, like I said, with many of these groups who I've been mentioning, so that it is directly useful to them, not just a research project that's documenting, but that's actually contributing to the goals of these groups. And so the project title and objectives we came up with are included here. So some of the research questions are, how are community groups and organizations across Montreal seizing the COVID crisis to push for transformative change? What's being learned collectively in communities and community organizations about how we seize crises to push for transformative? What are we learning together? And then several key themes came up. One is how the municipal government's efforts to respond to COVID, how that's supporting or hindering the work going on. And thinking together about how COVID responses from the government could be rendered more supportive, much more supportive to the transformative work going on in communities. So that's this part about linking or connecting the bottom up and top down efforts to transform Montreal during this time. So There are a bunch of research objectives. A lot of them are around using this research effort to support and link all these different initiatives going on across the city. But yeah, so right now we're in the first stage. I'm conducting interviews. So we're doing about 40 interviews. I'm about 15 interviews in to 40 interviews with these organizers across the city to think together and get their reflections about how funding structures are working or not working for them, how the responses from the municipal government or provincial governments are working or not working for them, et cetera. And then later on, at the end of November, probably we'll be meeting with Montreal municipal policymakers and decision makers to tell them how they should be doing their job so as to be much more supportive to the amazing work going on in communities to transform the way Montreal functions towards much more equitably, much more sustainably. And then we'll be, developing a couple of reports. And then actually this was something that came up a lot in our design meetings, like how do we make this not just a couple of reports that sit on shelves and never get read? So the idea is then to develop a campaign together to actually put pressure on the different decision makers and others to actually adopt the calls to action we'll be coming up with that'll come out of this. So briefly, just before I end, some of what I'm hearing in these interviews about, this is just very preliminary. I haven't done the analysis yet, so this is just sort of top of the mind stuff. In terms of what I'm hearing about how the work groups are doing has changed during COVID and how COVID is sort of helping the work towards transforming Montreal, how it's helping. So I've been hearing that there's more and better communication across different organizations, groups, and movements and communities, and there's more efforts to join forces, as opposed to people working in different issue silos or different communities as it was before. There's more people have more time to donate to social movements. That's great. More average folks are seeing that our systems are not working, and more people are seeing the links between different issues like climate change, inequality, racism, all the poverty, etc. Seeing the links and seeing the disproportional impacts. COVID's really been, like climate change and other issues, is really playing out disproportionately, impacting some people way more than others. So people are really seeing that in a way that maybe was just like theoretical to them about climate change, but they're seeing it play out through COVID in a very real and current way. And there's been a mainstreaming of really radical ideas. It's like prison abolition. There's a real big push towards releasing prisoners because there's a big COVID outbreak here in just outside of Montreal. There has been more talk about basic universal basic income and mutual aid, which used to be a radical anarchist idea, has become widely taken up by all kinds of folks, and with the intention to keep this kind of community self-organization, keep that social fabric that's being developed, keep it like let it remain as beyond COVID, so that communities stay organized and continue to take care for each other and ourselves in other crises to come, and just normal life that ever happens again. I've been hearing that decision makers and policymakers are more open to alternatives than they had been, or hearing sort of radical alternatives. Like I said, lots of collective visioning towards how things could be much better, and more time to take stock of where we're at. But at the same time, it's not all rosy, because a lot of people who had been doing transformative work before, trying to push for systems change, a lot of energy has been diverted to just meeting emergency needs, keeping people alive, keeping people fed, which of course needs to happen. And of course, systemic inequalities are being exacerbated during this time. So making people who are working on the front lines, their work a lot harder than it had been. And that as more and more communications are going online, people are communicating in ways that are even more less heartful than before. And this is leading to increased polarization and all kinds of things. I don't know if anyone relates to that. And it's in terms of social movement organizing, it's hard to mobilize sometimes when you can't hit the streets. And I've heard a lot of people talk about, as we're going into a second wave, people are tired. people are tired from mobilizing, organizing, and responding throughout the whole first wave. So yeah, it's not all rosy, but I'm really excited to be documenting this collective learning and having these conversations, because I think as the climate crisis mounts, we need to be really getting good at seizing crises, to push for transformative change, to restructure our various social systems and political and economic systems with each crisis that arises. And to do that, we need to get pretty good at working together. We need to build those relations of mutual aid, not just in our communities, but across different movements, between researchers and communities. I think if this, mutual aid can be a sort of organizing principle in our work to respond to crises together. I think we're making progress. So I look forward to giving an update on this when the research project is further along to you all. But yeah, thank you for listening. And if you want to buy my book, it's for sale by Fernwood Press, which you can get online. Thanks for listening.